Sobre esta colección, el profesor Chong ha escrito varios libros, entre ellos Eye of the Beholder, y comisariado exposiciones muy variadas que van desde el arte asiático hasta artistas contemporáneos que están en residencia en este museo. Además de especializarse en coleccionismo y mecenazgo, ha investigado en profundidad la pintura de paisaje y la naturaleza muerta en la escuela holandesa. En el 99-2000 comisarió con el profesor Chloe, que hemos tenido también en este curso, la muestra sobre Still Life Paintings en el Rijksmuseum y en el Cleveland Museum of Art, y su trabajo en este género le ha valido numerosos reconocimientos. Por eso, para la conferencia de hoy, Alegorías de la abundancia, la naturaleza muerta en Flandes, analizará la relevancia que esta tuvo entre importantes pintores flamencos y el coleccionismo que estas obras de arte tan valoradas en la época generó, además de sugerir una connotación de la celebración de la abundancia de la naturaleza que muchos de los bodegones representan. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. My subject is still life painting in Flanders, which is the Spanish Netherlands in the 17th century, the southern part, what is today probably best known as Belgium. The Prado is really the perfect place for the study of this material. It's really safe to say the finest collection of Flemish still life paintings. That's the first reason. The second reason is the Prado's website has to be the best collection website in the world. You can have and download high resolution images at different resolutions. It's perfect for preparing a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm very grateful to the Prado for the second of these reasons. I'm talking today about still life paintings of the 16th and 17th century. And these paintings are very difficult because at first glance they appear to be about nothing. That is, they have no explicit subject matter, they have no narrative, no story to tell. At least that's the way it appears at first. This lack of subject has actually long disturbed modern scholars who have wanted to assign moralistic or emblematic or religious meanings to these paintings. But in fact, they're very beautiful images, as in this case by Peter Artson, of food, of flowers, of objects, of things. One of the first commentators on still life paintings is the ancient Greek writer named Philostratus, who in the 4th century AD visited a villa outside Naples, saw a beautiful collection of paintings, and wrote one of the first discourses on art. And one of these discourses was about still life painting. And it's ironic to realize in his introduction, Philostratus says that the only reason he wrote about these paintings is that a 10-year-old boy at the villa kept asking him annoying questions. So not to be rude, he began to prepare a short text about the history of art. So that's, in a way, a good lesson to us all, not to be too concerned with meaning, perhaps. Well, many of the first still lifes produced in Flanders, like Peter Artson's beautiful painting of a meat pantry of 1551, are about food. And this is a great example of a painting about food. We have a side of a cow been split open, a bull's head or cow's head in the foreground, sausages of various types, pig's head in the back, some fish, butter on the left side, smoked fish. And it's so full, in fact, that the various foodstuffs even threaten to tip over. They even fall out in the corner of the picture. They flow over the edge of the canvas. This is, in fact, the actual edge of the canvas. And what the artist does is he uses the edge of the picture to cut off some of the objects in the picture, so it really seems to protrude into our space. And above us, a pole hangs right over our heads, or seems to hang over our heads, holding what is at more sausages and pieces of meat. We're really overwhelmed by this abundance of food. Beautiful colors and textures are in every corner of the picture. Well, I suppose we are meant to ask what the painting actually means. Does it have a narrative beyond just all of these beautiful food? And in fact, on closer inspection, what we discover is that there are things happening behind the scene. There's all of this meat and food in the front, but behind through the various windows and interstices of the picture, we find different subjects. There's a landscape with a church at the left. There are a group of figures along a road here in the center. And here on the right is more food and some people dining, perhaps at an inn. And if we look closely at a detail in the center, we see there's a woman riding a donkey here, handing out objects to people here. And what we realize very quickly is we're glimpsing the Virgin on the road to Egypt, perhaps, giving alms or food to the poor. So in the background is an explicit commentary on the food in the foreground. There's a certain tension between front and back. And I think the viewer is meant to ask how one makes sense of this. Which is more important? Is it the background or the foreground? And as you very well know, this type of relationship between detail and large object in painting is something that plagues not only Flemish painting, but of course Spanish painting as well, the famous example being Velázquez's fable of Ariadne here in the museum. Is it about the background, Minerva and Ariadne, or about the foreground, the beautiful weavers and spinners in the front? I've always believed that these small vignettes, because they are details, command our attention. Just because they're small does not mean they're unimportant. The eye goes to these objects, goes to these little narrative scenes, and we're really challenged to make sense of it. So in a way, a painting like this one doesn't really focus our attention on any particular detail. We're meant to put it all together on some level. And this is particularly important if we remember the patron, the owner of this picture, would have seen it every day and would have come to it, hopefully, looking at different things and trying to understand different parts of the picture. Well, there are a few other clues in the painting. For example, there's a little inscription here at the upper right, which reports to us that land is for sale, that you could buy land by the foot or by the rod. And there's also a measuring stick here on the left, marked with strange symbols of various sorts, which is very likely a licensed meter stick, which allowed people to sell various foodstuffs and objects in the area around Antwerp. So one argument might suggest that food is being sold in the foreground just as land is being sold in the back. So some art historians have argued that the painting is about commerce, it's about the market, it's about the exchange of money for commodities, whether that's food or land or fish or perhaps even painting itself. Well, the one interesting thing about Peter Artsen, who became a very celebrated painter in Antwerp, is that he crafts all of his details into a pleasing whole. He invites the viewer to roam through the picture, to return to marvel at the various things. And it's really this overwhelming sense of object and as well as color that commands our attention. And in fact, we can turn to contemporary sources that tell us that Artsen's painting was praised as being manly and virile, actually was a masculine form of painting because of his very expressive brushwork and his daring use of color. And I think this overall presentation of the painting has a strong sense of visual delight, a sense of being overwhelmed, and it's a kind of influential means of making still lifes that would really persist in Europe for the next 100 years. In a sense, Artsen gives birth to the art of still life in Europe. And I'm just going to give you one example because it's a very powerful example of how things seem to overflow. This is another work by Peter Artsen in Vienna, where, again, a piece of meat hangs over this doorway attached to some kind of dish. It tips precariously as though it's going to topple over into our space. And in the other corner, here are some money bags tied up. Again, they seem to float in space between the proper space of the painting and our space. Artson is an artist that collapses the sense of perspective and makes objects seem to come into our own realm, giving his work a kind of immediacy and power that is very unusual. Now, in the same way, of course, the rest of the painting enacts many of the similar types of strategies that he saw before. In the background, for example, are figures. In this case, Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. Here, a kitchen scene, which again relates very clearly to the pantry or the foodstuff scene in the foreground. Again, that sense of backwards and forward space in this area. Well, many of these devices occur in other later still life paintings, not just in Flanders, but also in Spain. And I'm just giving you one example that has always struck me. Sanchez Cotan's beautiful still life in the Prado from 1602 uses the same strategy of objects hung out of nowhere. They seem to come, emerge from some unseen device or ledge directly into our own space, our own world, in a very similar way that we saw here. And there's 50 years difference between these two paintings, but they're really up to many of the same types of things. Now, Peter Artson's paintings have an important ancient precedent. His pictures of food, of markets, of pantries, of farms, have a precedent really in ancient painting. And it is really Philostratus in a treatise called Iconus that I talked about earlier, who actually invents a name for this type of painting. It's called xenia. And he uses it to denote paintings of fruit, honey, milk, and meat. And this was translated into Latin in Italy in 1530, and then into French in 1578. And as we know, the Renaissance preoccupation with ancient texts and ancient ideas meant that Philostratus's work became very popular amongst artistic circles in the 16th and 17th century. More importantly, the commentators on Philostratus, particularly the French commentator Blaise de Vignières, says in 1578 that xenia means hospitality, that these paintings of food are meant to welcome people into a palace or into a house. And he's not the only one. Franciscus Junius in 1638 confirmed that still lifes of foods were demonstrations of mutual hospitality and gift-giving. So on one very basic, simple level, paintings of foods are meant to celebrate the abundance of one house in welcoming a guest in. This may be behind the meaning or behind the associations of many still life paintings from this period. Peter Artson's son-in-law and pupil, Joachim Boykelar, follows in Artson's footsteps and, if anything, increases the abundance, the overwhelming sense of foodstuffs. And Boykelar created many of his still lifes in series, a series of 2 or 4, showing different kinds of food. And in Flanders in the 16th and 17th century, such serialization of food imagery becomes extremely common. And I'm just showing you one example of Boykelar's work. This is a beautiful painting in Ghent. And it shows a multiplicity of different types of foods and vegetables. And it's very interesting how he takes a cabbage and shows you not just one cabbage, but 5 or 6 different ones from different angles, and lots of figs and lots of grapes of different textures and varieties. This duplication, the redoubling of imagery is, I think, part of the way of communicating the abundance on offer in this particular farm, for example. Later, as we make our way into the 17th century, paintings of foods become increasingly refined and move sometimes indoors to these set tables. And this is an example by the Flemish artist Ozias Beert, who sets before us on a very simple table some elegant glasses of wine, oysters, shellfish of various sorts, and some quince jelly, which is probably this thing in this wooden lid. And he is responsible for developing this new type of simple still life, something that's really followed by a remarkable artist named Clara Peters. And once again, her most important cycle of paintings, a group of 4 pictures, I think it's a group of 4 anyway, are here at the Prado. And they show really classification of food, but often mixed and varied in very interesting ways. Here, for example, is a collection of shot birds, of game birds of various sorts arrayed on a table. But added to it are these wonderful white plates and dishes on one side and some shells. Also part of this series is a collection of seafood, but enhancing the image of seafood in a sense is a colander with these beautiful artichokes. And a third painting in this cycle is a beautiful laid table with a pie and some prepared foods and a beautiful dish of salt here, salt cellar. The only flaw in the Prado's website that I could determine was I couldn't find the 4th painting from this series by Clara Peters. That's the only one. Just to give another example, a painter named Alexander Adriansen really specialized in the textures of seafood. And I think in this painting of eel and fish, you really get a sense of the slipperiness, the sliminess of the seafood. And it's, still life is a form of art that really encouraged artists to specialize, to create with great verisimilitude and intensity the surfaces, the textures, and the colors of a particular type of object. And Adriansen is not a famous or celebrated painter by any stretch of the imagination, but he's able to specialize in fish in this wonderful, in the wonderful example that you see here. This belongs actually to a cycle, presumably of 6 paintings, and they were owned, there's an important Spanish connection because they were owned by the Marqués de Leganés, and they were bequeathed by him to Philip IV, and 4 of the paintings remain in the Museo del Prado here. And they're an important example of this kind of serialization of food imagery. Well, as the 17th century progresses, the imagery around food takes a new turn, especially around the circle of Peter Paul Rubens. And the most important artist in this regard is a man named Franz Snyders, who was not just a painter of still lifes, but also a painter of animals. And he's really one of the great underappreciated multiple artists, I think, of the 17th century. He was able to paint in many different modes in a very, very energetic and vigorous style. He too created a number of important series, and in particular, he created a series of 4 extremely large paintings for a grand house in Brussels for a man named Jacques van Offen, who was a receiver general of Brussels, and they were painted in 1618 to decorate presumably one of the large entry halls. Well, actually, the hall at the landing of the first staircase in this really magnificent house. The 4 paintings are now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and I'm just showing you 2 of them. But they show a variety of food, and here the food imagery has been divided between fruits, vegetables, meat, and fish, so they're paintings devoted to each of these groups of food. And one is really overwhelmed by the scale of these paintings. It's difficult to actually describe how large and how abundant the paintings are. And I think through a painting like this, if we believe Philostratus and commentators like Junius, a visitor to Van Offen's wonderful residence in Brussels would have felt welcome, but also very impressed by the opulence of this particular individual who could afford not only food on this scale, but also sophisticated large paintings of food. And I think there's a very interesting collapse in the imagery of opulence, not only of what is depicted, but also in the artistry of the painters involved. And there's no mistaking this, because Franz Snijders was extremely famous and highly paid for his work of this sort. Less exalted citizens could also own paintings like this, and they're startling examples of, for example, a fish merchant owning a painting of fish, a fish still life by Franz Snijders, and a cook owning 5 paintings of food by Snijders. So there's some suggestion that individuals were able to commission and own paintings relevant to their own profession and their own activities. Now, also interesting is Rubens's collaboration with Snijders, and one of the great examples of this is also in the Prado, and it depicts, at least on the left, the recognition of Filippo Men, who was a famous Greek general, and it depicts his disguise. Here is the general, and he returns to his home in disguise, and actually works in the fields in front of his house until one day he's discovered by his family, and they're amazed to see him in this garb. But you can see that the figures have been crammed to one side of the picture, and the rest of the painting is this beautiful still life. So Rubens, in this particular painting, is responsible for these figures, obviously, and Snijders is responsible for the still life. And here the painting has been divided with this beautiful peacock, the slain peacock here, and a swan, 2 of the most opulent birds that one could consume as game, and a basket of fruit and vegetables. What's very interesting is that we have Rubens's original sketch for the painting, which is in the Louvre, and I show it to you on the right side of the screen. It's kind of low, I hope you can all see it. But the idea of the picture comes presumably from Rubens himself, who sketched out the entire painting on a much smaller piece of wood, a wooden panel. And in this work, he invented the whole scene. He sketched not only the figures, but he also sketched the food and the still life as well, plotting exactly how it would go. And it's only when the final painting is made that Snijders steps in and follows Rubens's model and varies it in a way that you can see here. And I think the comparison is very interesting because, couple points. Rubens conceives this as a still life. So he pushes the figures by his own accord off to one side so that the painting is really dominated by these wonderful game birds and these objects, knowing full well that Franz Snijders would do an opulent job in completing the picture. Secondly, Snijders changes the composition and actually enhances the role of the still life. For example, you can see very clearly for yourself that the peacock has been expanded so it becomes this very large diagonal to divide the painting into 2 different parts. The swan is there, almost exactly the same, but has been painted in greater detail. Look at the basket. I find this too a fascinating comparison. Basket and its foodstuffs are already sketched in roughly, but what Snijders does is give it a kind of solidity and structure by giving these vegetables greater prominence and this fantastic gourd on one side. The whole basket takes on an overall shape and flow. It has a clear-cut outline in a way that Rubens, perhaps not being the natural still life painter, did not fully conceive at the start. And I think it's interesting to see this kind of very close collaboration between a still life painter and obviously a supreme figural artist like Rubens. Snyder's also painted, as I said, smaller still lifes. In fact, the great majority of his work is of smaller pictures such as this, which is about less than a meter wide. And it typically shows a little bit of everything. So on one side, some game, some shot birds and a bunny, a rabbit, and fruit, here aligned in a beautiful, arranged in a beautiful taza. And also typical of Snyder's, he tends to chop off the edges of his objects so that they seem to flow off into the area beyond the painting. But this combination of fruit and game is one that's very common in Snyder's work as in other of his followers. The most prominent of his followers is Jan Veit, and I'm showing you one example here, which again shows some fruit, some artichokes, and then some game birds that have been shot after a day's hunt. And very nicely we see a parrot facing off with the hunting dog. They sort of have come face to face, and these figures, these animals, give the whole painting a little bit of energy and drama and structure. But I do wonder whether the combination, this constant combination of fruit and game, is again not meant to suggest the bounty of a farm. And the popularity of ancient writers such as Horace and Virgil, which celebrated the joys of farm life, especially the ability to grow one's own food, wasn't something that was foremost in the minds of these Flemish still life artists, as well as artists in Holland in the 17th century. I think paintings like this are really meant to tap into the joys of country living, the independence of being able to shoot game and grow fruit and vegetables. And these are very strong topics in poetry, not only in the ancient world, but also in the 17th century. A different kind of abundance and bounty could be discovered in the work of Jan de Heem. And here, more than the examples we've seen before, the opulence of food is combined with the beauty of things. And so not only do we see, for example, a lobster and fruit and various seafood such as oysters, we also see now beautiful silver vessels, gold goblets, an exotic parrot, actually two exotic parrots, presumably from the New World that have come to adorn this palatial setting. And Jan de Heem is a curious example of an artist who's born in Utrecht, actually born in the Netherlands, in the north, and spends much of his career in Antwerp. He moves south in order to find patronage there. And I think it's important also to remember that still life is an international art form, almost more so than any other genre. Still lifes were collected immediately across Europe, in England, in Italy, as well as in the northern Netherlands. And so these artists became popular throughout the continent. Well, I'd like to turn now to flowers, because they represent the bounty of nature in a very different form. And especially to look closely at a man named Jan Bruegel the Elder, who is the eldest son of the famous Peter Bruegel, who painted peasant scenes in the early part of the 16th century. Jan Bruegel the Elder had almost no contact whatsoever with his famous father, but he inherited certainly much of his artistic inclinations. And around 1600, he began to paint flowers in very simple bouquets, but structured in a very realistic sort of way, so that each flower was carefully depicted to show its texture, its color, and the feeling of the translucence of the blossom. But they've also been presented with an overall arrangement that's pleasing and that has an overall sense of light and shadow. And this is an innovation in flower painting that really happens throughout Europe about the same time, around 1600. Well, an extremely important collector at this moment is a man named Cardinal Federico Borromeo, who is based in Milan. And he was particularly keen on acquiring the work of Jan Bruegel, and particularly his flower paintings. And he actually asked Jan Bruegel to paint him a flower picture, and Jan Bruegel responds by saying that he will spend all of his energy to collect various specimens, to work for more than a year so that he would see different flowers at different times of year when they were in bloom, and that he would create a particularly magnificent flower picture for the cardinal. What's important to remember is the Cardinal Borromeo already owned one of the most important still life paintings in the history of art, and that is this beautiful basket of fruit by Caravaggio, painted in the 1590s, probably no more than a decade before Jan Bruegel's flower picture. Borromeo purchased this picture and wrote in a letter that he hoped to find a companion to Caravaggio's still life, but was never able to ever find something directly comparable, and therefore never placed another painting beside it. Instead, of course, he commissioned 5 or 6 paintings from Jan Bruegel, these beautiful flower pictures. Well, when Cardinal Borromeo delivered, no point saying anything about the enclosed image at the center, for it is a lesser light that is outshone by all the splendors around it. And this is really remarkable, that Rubens in 1620 was certainly one of the supreme painters of Europe, and yet the cardinal, perhaps wanting to be witty or contrary, says that the fruit and flowers around the painting by Rubens were more important and were more beautiful. But it certainly shows how wonderful Bruegel really was at crafting these images. This particular painting I think is of exceptional quality, and even in details like these rabbits and the other animals in the foreground. There's a beautiful rabbit here. Have a precision, but also a rich sense of shadow that really distinguishes Bruegel's works from all others. Now, although we spend a lot of time debating the meaning of these pictures, Cardinal Borromeo actually says that, and here again I quote, "When I ordered the painting, I did not think either of symbols or of allegories, but only of how in the winter a painting of flowers would make it a beautiful sight." So it's very interesting that even a religious thinker, a theologian, did not immediately conceive of these paintings as having strong symbolic meaning or value, but rather thought of them as being delightful images. Now, there's been a great deal of debate in the history of art about what these paintings of flowers and fruit and various objects might mean. And we've analyzed very closely a set of printed images with captions, some of them of emblematic, some of them of poetic value. And I'm just going to show you a few of these as reminders that they are not ways of interpreting the paintings. They're really objects which exist in their own right. These are 2 prints from a beautiful book compiled by Joris Hoefnagel in 1592. And as you can see, they are images of flowers and fruit, mushrooms, butterflies, insects of various sorts of them, some of them devouring apples, for example, you see on the right. And the poems that he attaches to these images are all very different. In fact, one of them says enigma, which simply means riddle. And the texts that he chose are quotations from ancient and contemporary poetry, but also quotations from Erasmus from the early 16th century that contain different types of meanings. And I think a book like this was not meant to be a way of saying that flowers always mean a certain thing, and it's a mistake to use these types of prints to read pictures, read paintings explicitly. For example, Erasmus in the 16th century, a source quoted by Hoefnagel, already compared real versus painted flowers. And he says, rather than drawing a religious or symbolic meaning from a flower painting, Erasmus says, "We are twice pleased when we see a painted flower, competing with a living one. In one, we can admire the artifice of nature, in other, the genius of the painter. And in each, we find the goodness of God. So it's a very interesting comparison about the power of nature versus the power of the painter. In other ways, I think art historians have perhaps made errors in interpretation by trying to compare images such as the emblem that you see on the left by Rumer Visser with a painting of books you see on the right, by saying that the religious power of books to convert the wild and savage nature of mankind should be read into all paintings of books. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. An emblem, like you see on the left, was another sense of delight and wonderment. It was not meant to be a key to all paintings of this sort. Indeed, it's really the ancient sources that one keeps coming back to. Ancient poetry, myths, the stories of Plutarch and Pliny and Philostratus. And Rubens and Ozias Beert, in this remarkable collaboration in the Sarasota Museum, the Ringling Museum, shows exactly this. It depicts a beautiful flower seller named Glycera, who created such beautiful arrangements of flowers, such as you see here, that her betrothed, the painter Pausias, painted them. So again, it's the use of nature to inspire great art that Rubens decided to depict in this marvelous example. I don't mean to deny that there's religious or symbolic meaning in still life paintings. In fact, in many cases, it's absolutely obvious. And in an example like this, where the painter Daniel Sagers created beautiful flowers around the religious image by Erasmus Quirinus, the religious content of the work of art is absolutely clear. And it's made doubly clear because Daniel Sagers was actually a member of the Jesuit order and became celebrated for creating his paintings. He was the painter who was also a Jesuit, and his work was in great demand throughout Europe, not only in Catholic courts, but actually also in Protestant courts. And he made this very clear by signing his pictures with the name of his order, the capital J-E-S-U, on nearly all of his paintings. And very interestingly, we know that Jesuit missionaries to India and China actually took Sagers' paintings along with them. Again, the purpose being a matter of speculation, but it's interesting to conceive that beautiful paintings of flowers were taken around the world in the 17th century by Jesuit missionaries. And in other paintings, such as that by Peter Boole that you see here, again, the allegorical image is made very explicit. There's on the side of this coffin, of this sarcophagus, is written vanitati sacrificium, the sacrifice to vanity. And a painting like this is really about the vainness of worldly possessions, the emptiness of worldly life. And you can see that all kinds of worldly goods, armor, crowns, but also religious orders, even the painter's easel, musical instruments, all of these things are empty and cannot be taken to the next world. These are precious possessions that must be left behind at the time of death. So a painting like this is very explicit in its allegory. It's very explicit in its symbolic meaning. It is a reminder that, that we should approach worldly possessions with a great deal of caution. But many other paintings generate different types of meanings. And what's interesting about so many Flemish paintings of this period is that they're about art and collecting. And I'll conclude my little talk with some considerations about images concerning art. One of the most interesting of these are those by Franz Franken, who's an important still life painter from the first decades of the 17th century. And in a series of very interesting paintings, he seems to be illustrating a little collection, a collector's cabinet, a group of objects that an enthusiastic amateur, for example, might accumulate. And this is a very good example of exactly this type of painting. What we have here is a table, and behind the table are several very small paintings, landscapes, portraits, religious scenes, history paintings. There are also beautiful sculptures, but also a little collection of coins, some seashells, a little lock for some reason, and then a portrait here. Seashells, and even a Chinese porcelain cup, a rarity that could be imported from the Far East. And I think these images really suggest the enthusiasm of a collector, the love of small, precious objects, the enthusiasm that many people brought to the passion of collecting. Now, look in the background. We've seen over and over again how little vignettes in the back give us little clues about what's happening. And here, what do we see? We see a group of connoisseurs, very well-dressed gentlemen, inspecting works of art here, gathering in the back. Now, what's very interesting is that Frank had made several of these paintings. There are 8 altogether, and in some of them, the picture in the back is always different. And I'm showing you a comparison with another example of these collector cabinets, where something very different is happening behind. I hope you can all see this because it's clearest in black and white. I'll explain it to you, but there is a man, standing man here, with the horse of a donkey. Do you see that? He's got long donkey ears and the head of a donkey, and he's holding a stick, and he's smashing the sculptures and the globes and the other objects in the foreground. So what a comparison, huh? Here, gentlemen inspecting works of art, and here, ass-headed men destroying objects, destroying the productions of civilization. 2 totally different images. And I think it's an intriguing contrast, don't you think? That Franken shows in one picture respect for art, and in the other how ignorance destroys art is essentially the message there. And he uses very different backgrounds to really celebrate, I think, the collector and the possessions of the collector in different ways. The final category of art seems, therefore, often to be concerned with collecting. And I'm showing you another one by Gijsbrechts, Cornelis Norbertus Gijsbrechts, who's born in Antwerp, as far as we know, but spent most of his life in Germany and Denmark, painting for aristocratic courts, especially for the Danish royal court in Copenhagen. And he takes all of the skills of the Netherlandish painters, the love of detail and texture, the command of light and shadow, and he uses it really in the rarefied atmosphere of a royal court. And in this example, we see many of the same things we've seen before, collection of seashells, some precious objects here. But in the very center is a large piece of paper, which is actually the royal patent granted to the painter. So it's actually Gijsbrechts' own royal patent appointing him painter to the King of Denmark. So the trumpet here and the various objects are actually celebrating painting generally, but more specifically celebrating Gijsbrechts himself. It is one of the most egotistical paintings I know in the history of art. Although the artist does not actually appear in portrait form, we see his grand accomplishment, his celebration by the King of Denmark. And very often, paintings of this sort contain jokes, contain little witty intrigues of various sorts. For example, Gijsbrechts actually painted a painting in the shape of an easel. So this is a form of painting that exists throughout Europe. It's not particularly common, but it does exist. Paintings that have been cut out in a particular shape. And in this case, you can see it's a still life painting set on an easel, a portrait, a letter from the king, the palette, a canvas. All of this is paint cut out to be this particular very, very strange shape. And it's a painting that is still in the National Museum of Copenhagen. And one can only imagine that set into a dark corner, it would seem like the real thing. It would seem so real that one would be surprised by it. And indeed, when we turn to ancient literature, this is one of the most common topics in descriptions about art. Pliny, for example, tells us that the ancient painter Zeuxis painted grapes that were so realistic, birds tried to eat the grapes off of the painting, and that Zeuxis himself was fooled by a fellow artist who painted a cabinet with a seal on it and a curtain, and when Zeuxis tried to come, he tried to, when he approached the painting, he actually tried to lift the curtain off of the painting and was therefore himself fooled by another artist. And these stories were repeated over and over again. Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, was reportedly fooled by a painting when he tried to open a door. And one sees, in fact, some of these works of art still. A work by Samuel van Hoogstraten on the left is actually a painting of a cabinet door. So you see all of this in oil paint, but this glint and this door appears so real it could almost open. And Gijsbrechts and many others often painted curtains in exactly this way. And there seems to have been a demand, especially at aristocratic courts. And there are examples of this not only in the Holy Roman Empire, in Vienna, for example, but also in London at the courts of Charles I and later at Charles II, and at the King of Denmark, where the delight in being fooled by paintings like this were an important part of the status of the artist. And it's really the Flemish still life painters, Hoogstraten, of course, is Dutch rather than Flemish, but they all participate in this pan-European trickery, as it were. Perhaps Gijsbrechts' most remarkable painting is this depiction of a back of a picture, this famous plain canvas, seemingly of absolutely nothing, the back of a stretcher. The only thing to really let us into the joke is this wax seal with a number on it. See, a little wax seal holding a piece of paper, 36. We don't know what 36 is. Maybe it's something important. Well, it's these kinds of jokes that really had a great appeal. They questioned the role of art. What is a still life? Is it about anything at all? And it's really the type of ultimate non-narrative picture. At the end of the 17th century, still life painting falls into decline. And I always wonder whether it's jokes like this that really get people annoyed. In France, for example, André Felibien in 1669 actually wrote that painters of fruit, flowers, or shells and of dead, motionless things were really the lowest kind of painter. They occupied the lowest rung in the categories of art, while those who imitated God by painting human figures outshine all other artists in excellence. And this is something one finds over and over again. Samuel van Hoogstraten, Gerard de la Ressa continually say that still life is a form for feeble spirits. And this actually happens in Spain as well. Francisco Pacheco wrote in 1638, in a treatise published only in 1649, that flower paintings, for example, by the famous Florencio, I think he probably means Jan Bruegel the Elder, could be very entertaining, but they really were not very serious. That one could be diverted by such interesting pictures, but they would never really give the painter much glory. In Holland, Karel van Mander had already hinted in 1604 that if you were not good at painting figures, you might be able to paint animals, kitchens, fruit, or flowers. So he's actually saying that if you're a less good painter and you can't make it as a figure painter, you should turn your attention to still lifes, which are easier to paint. So this is what happens to still life in the course of the 17th century, a decline in its status. I'm glad to say that it's temporary, and there are always some patrons who love still lifes and who continue to collect them. And what happens is that aristocratic and royal patrons continue to delight in these famous, in these wonderful works of art. And I'm going to conclude with this particular example because it's a painting by Franz Snyders, and it shows just the respect that Franz Snyders had in the 17th century. It is a painting that was owned by the Marquess de Leganés. He acquired it immediately after it was painted in 1633, and then a few years later, in 1634, it was given to Philip IV, where it entered the royal collection. So this beautiful painting was acquired very quickly by a notable connoisseur and enters one of the most famous collections in Europe, where it has fortunately remained ever since. So on one level, there was a certain amount of respect and status among aristocratic painters. Gijsbrecht's working in Denmark, Daniel Sager's working for patrons throughout Europe. So if the dominance of the official academies brought still life in Flanders into decline in the 17th century, this was only a temporary situation. And our own era, thankfully, has shown a strong revival in interest in the part not only of scholars and private collectors for these beautiful still life paintings, but also for enthusiastic museum visitors the world over. Thanks very much.